Hello, everyone, and welcome as you join in our webinar today. Thank you very much. And I see that the numbers are growing and everybody seems to be in time, which is really great. We'll have 45 minutes together, so let me start right away. My name is Arturo Briz. I am the director of the IMD World Competitiveness Center, talking from Lausanne today. I'm extremely proud and happy to announce the launch of our 2021 IMD World Digital Rankings. The team has been working hard for the last hours. It's almost sleepless. And we have already announced our public results that you can actually consult in our website or in many of the media outlets that have publicized them. You will not be surprised to learn that the United States tops the rankings, that small economies like Denmark or Switzerland are on the top 10, and China increased 15 positions in the last 4 years to make it to number 15 this year as well. Anyway, the objective of the webinar is not to provide you with the details of the rankings. As I said, they can be consulted everywhere, but to have a discussion with 3 experts on what we identify are the key trends of the digital competitiveness journey that many countries are pursuing this year. One trend that we have identified is the dominance of China and the United States. A second trend that we identify is the importance of digital talent to make sure that countries stay competitive, digitally speaking. And the third trend that we highlight is the importance of the data economy. The realization that data is a very important asset that will allow companies, but also countries, to monetize their digital transformation. So these are the themes that we will discuss today. I want to welcome you all. I know that you are speaking from many different parts of the world, in many different time zones. And remember that in order to interact, you can always use the chat that I'm just reading. And when questions come, I will take them to our panelists. Okay. Let me start introducing you our first panelist. His name is Jose Parra Moyano. He's a assistant professor at Copenhagen Business School, and I'm extremely honored and pleased that Jose is joining us today because he's an expert on the use of digital technologies and combines practical in the industry with academic expertise. Just to give you a few details about Jose, he has been appointed Forbes 30 under 30 as a promising young scholar, and also appointed as global shaper by the World Economic Forum. I think these credentials are just a small part of his achievements, and despite his youth, he's already a well-recognized expert. I want to ask Jose first about the data economy, because as I said earlier, it is where we see that digital competitiveness is changing different countries. To what extent do you think that data is going to be a transformative asset? And how do you see that companies and countries are going to use data to monetize it in a set of new business models?
Well, thank you very much, Arturo, for the question, and thank you very much for having me here today. I'm the honored one being in your company today. In terms of your question, and what we have observed in our research in the last years is that data has actually become a factor of production. And this is extremely interesting because usually the economy has behaved in a manner that it takes factors of production, like capital or labor, and transforms them in something valuable, like an output. This applies both to countries, but also to firms. Now, what we have observed doing several analyses is that data is a new factor of production, meaning that those countries or those firms that gather data and analyze those data are going to be able to produce more, to generate more value than those that having the same level of capital, having the same level of human capital or labor, basically those that have more data will produce more. And this is extremely interesting because suddenly data starts to become a kind of substitute or enabler of other factors of production, like capital or labor. Let me give you a very short example. Imagine that a country suddenly suffers a brain drain. So workers leave the country and go abroad. the effect that this has on the country is that it usually reduces the GDP. It reduces the amount of value it generates. However, if that country suffering from the brain drain would open up data sets, generate open data for the remaining firms, for the remaining workers to work with this data, GDP would rise. And this is extremely interesting because suddenly we can start substituting capital or labor with data. And this has never happened before.
That's a good insight, and that's very useful. I think we'll keep on discussing that with the rest of our panelists. And let me introduce you to our second distinguished guest today. Her name is Karin Schevenburger. I hope I pronounce it well.
Okay.
Despite my non-existing German. Karin has many roles and has excelled in many different fields. Let me say primarily that she's a director at Meadows, which is a life science company. And she has also been working extensively on different aspects of technology. She has advised startups, large corporations all over the world, and is very close to technology from the industry side. She accumulates more than 15 years of experience working with international companies on business intelligence, market, business development, and implementation of marketing strategies, but very close to digital application. And that's where I wanted to ask Catherine, how does she see that digital competitiveness at the national level in Switzerland, but also in the United States or other countries, impact the ability of companies to excel? And how do you see the landscape for technology in this interaction between governments and private companies?
Yeah, thanks again also from my side, Arturo, for having me here. I'm quite honored. That's a very interesting question, and I'll give some examples from my field of activity, which is healthcare, where data in private companies and governments is extremely actual. The discussion around how to handle this and how to structure the data basically and make it available to private players and public players is extremely important as a discussion, and it's currently ongoing in pretty much every country. Overall, I think for me, the important point, coming back to what Jose also said, is that data per se, I don't think is valuable. It's basically the competitive advantage and the differentiation goes to companies and countries that use the data with the most profitable or most efficient business models. So data per se is, for me, not a factor of competitiveness or not, but it's the combination of specific data and the business models behind it and the value generation behind it that is really important. So if you look at the current largest companies in our ecosystem worldwide, if you look at Facebook, Google, etc., browsing data per se is maybe not very valuable, but it's valuable for Google because they have created a business system, an ecosystem, and a business model behind it where they can actually monetize it. Same for Uber, just knowing where I've been and where I want to go per se is probably not very valuable as a data point. For me, it isn't, apart from if I'm doing fitness tracking or something. But for Uber, having a large pool of data of where people are today, and not just me, but not just individuals, but a lot of people, is extremely valuable in their business model and their ability to deploy resources, in ability to know where to expand to, in the ability to know how to price, online. All of this is driven by data today and will confer huge competitive advantages to these companies that are able to harness the data that's available or that they generate or that they can, basically hoover up from public sources into profitable business models. So that's the first thing I want to say. And in healthcare, this is true more than anywhere else, where just the fact that radiology images, for example, or healthcare providers like hospitals have their data stored somewhere in an enterprise system in the hospital or even across hospital systems, that per se is not it hasn't driven any innovation in healthcare, but companies that then use this data in a large scale and in a profitable way to create value for all players in the ecosystem, so that be the hospital themselves, but also the payers, also hopefully the patients and other players, then that creates value and competitiveness. And I think countries, the last point I want to make is that countries that have these profitable companies that benefit from the data flow and the use of data will benefit from having these companies in their jurisdiction. That's true. Yeah. And lastly, it'll also create I think it'll create discrepancies, larger discrepancies than what we have today, because already the countries we're talking about, which is China or US or some of the larger European countries, they already own most of the production factors, right? The other production factors that Jose was talking about. So now that just gets amplified, the fact that they own these production systems and they own a lot of the data, that gets amplified. And I think that we will see discrepancies in the divergence about competitiveness of countries because of that.
Yes, and this is from our point of view at the World Competitiveness Center very important, because data creates a new source of inequality that hopefully we'll discuss later. That you have countries, you mentioned the example of Google, that monetizes its data very well and then benefits United States primarily and United States investors. And then you have countries on the contrary that are actually feeding those companies with data for no apparent benefit. So I keep that question for all of you later, because it's one of the questions that personally interests me the most. But this takes me to our third guest, who has already been showing us in his daily walk the beauty of Estonia's capital city, Tallinn. Our third honorary speaker is Martin Kaivats. He's the National Digital Advisor of Estonia, a country that is in our heart at the IMD World Competitiveness Center, because it has been used as a role model for many of our initiatives. Martin, on top of being National Digital Advisor and knowing how Estonia works from the digital standpoint extremely well, he's also the CEO of several startups and advisors to many others. And I'm very glad that Martin is here. Martin, as you walk in beautiful Tallinn, we're talking a few days ago about the Tallinn consensus and how Europe is placing in this digital competitiveness world. Can you tell us a little bit more about what Estonia has particularly been doing on the data and technology front in the last month and in the last year?
So, hello everybody, and also thank you Arturo and IMD. Also honored and humbled to be here. But yeah, long story short, in the beginning of September, we had some very important people here in Tallinn. We had several presidents like Charles Michel, President of the European Council, Secretary General of OECD, Corman. We had Gina Raimondo, the Secretary of Trade. And also, I think 4 prime ministers, 12 ministers overall. And we convened in the Tallinn Digital Summit. And a bit reflecting on Arturo's beginning, where in the digital maturity, we see a lot of battle between China and the US. Then, on my personal opinion, both of these models are Big Brother-like. So if you look at the world in longer perspective, then we need to have a third option. European Union is pushing for this with GDPR and things like that, but getting slowly closer, hopefully. But in the Tallinn Digital Summit, all of these leaders of the democratic world convened to talk about a concept called trusted connectivity. The idea that democratic countries should have a transparent and ethical financing of infrastructure project, an agreement or a framework, how to leverage the capacity of the private sector to invest in infrastructure. But nowadays, infrastructure is not only about roads, concrete, glass and the traditional brick and mortar style, but it always carries a digital component. And this digital component needs to be trusted. Based on those discussions, we launched the Tallinn Consensus, which is about that this kind of a framework should be established, and should be established not only by big countries such as US, Australia, and Japan, like the Blue Dot Network, but it should be deployed by getting as many governments and countries, including the little ones such as Estonia, on board with this. We are really hoping that this idea gets traction, and already we see, for example, just a week after the Prime Minister of Estonia and Charles Michel, the President of the European Council, published an idea how trusted connectivity could and should be the main idea behind the whole of European Union's infrastructure investments. So I think we are coming up to a stage, and a bit reflecting on Katrin and Jose before, that yes, the data monetization is a thing, but there needs to be trust in it as well. And I think coming from a small country who has built its own ecosystem based on transparency and data integrity, we know ways how we can provide value to the citizens without being Big Brother. And I hope that the country's size nowadays matters less than its ability to innovate. And we as Estonia are here to basically contribute as a platform, or as a, let's say, a honest broker of trust between those big countries who may or may not have geopolitical agendas. But sorry, we are still 1.3 million people. It's a piece of fly shit on a map. So we don't have those ambitions. Thank you.
You're on mute, Arturo.
Interesting insight that come out of your discussions. And so let me ask you a couple of questions that to me are interesting, generally speaking, that you all can answer. What do you think governments can do to support digital transformation of companies better? Okay, we at the end of the day try to assess the digital competitiveness of nations, and that's how we define it: the ability of countries to support digital transformation. But based on your experience, what do you think governments can nowadays? And Katrin, let me start with you, because you are the closest to the industry here. If in the businesses that you have advised, where do you feel the need for government intervention in terms of digital transformation?
Yeah, so the government intervention and regulation, and maybe not government intervention, right? So both sides. That's an interesting question, and I think for me, like I said earlier, and I think this is a very important discussion in my work, is that data is basically the cheapest and most abundant of all the factors that drive, digital competitiveness and competitiveness of country digital transformation. So data is the cheapest and most abundant of all the factors. The other factors are a vibrant entrepreneur ecosystem that actually will create these profitable business models. AI or data scientists, basically, so sufficient human capital so Jose, depending on who leaves the country, it actually can benefit or not, right? If all the people that are smart with data leave the country, you can have as much data as you like. It's not going to help the country more, and obviously regulation, right, around accessibility to data, trust, like Martin was saying. And basically an ecosystem where these factors that we were just talking about can thrive. And for me, that is the most important aspect. So basically human capital in entrepreneurship, as well as in AI, data, ML, machine learning, science. That's two of the most important factors, and regulation that actually regulates in a useful and beneficial way the access to data sets or to data, the use of the data, the trust, the GDPR. Somebody in the chat asked, is GDPR now hindering or favoring digital competitiveness? And the answer to that, I think, is it depends from my point of view, because as far as I can tell, GDPR implies a cost on businesses, but right now most companies and most people that I know don't care about GDPR. They just implemented whatever it had to be implemented, and most of them aren't touched. We as consumers aren't touched by GDPR, and the businesses, they aren't changing business strategy based on GDPR. So that's the same true for many regulations from countries. But when it comes to regulations that are hindering, in my opinion, the free flow of data and the accessibility of data and the useful use of data, then I think it's negative if it actually makes data available in an equitable fashion. So hospital data and healthcare, provider data, procedure data, for example, is very good example, or electronic health record data, for example. There's just a good framework in the countries that I work in, which is mostly Europe and the US and China, who can have access to this data, what this data can be used for, how it has to be analyzed, and that framework exists. And all the business questions around how do we create value from that, that's left to the companies. For me, that's ideal.
And I like to take it over from here and fully echo Katrin's words. It's so true. But I would rephrase it in a bit of a different way. The government's job is to create the architecture for the room where innovation can happen. In that room, there are these private sector companies who actually innovate. Governments will always be lagging behind in terms of innovation. It's just the nature of governance, bureaucratic systems. But creating this room and the architecture for it is the vital thing. And by architecture, I mean the governance architecture, which contains a technological architecture, legal architecture, and also the everyday cultural practices. The main lesson learned in creating an open government system here in Estonia is that this has got actually very little to do with technology and everything to do with building a mindset culture that is open and flexible and adaptable. So fully echo Katrin's word when she was saying that data is just one part, maybe not so valuable, but the ability to actually find the value in it and create the processes around it. And the problem is that redesigning those services and processes, especially in the government and public sector, to build this room full of trust where innovation can happen and where nobody is afraid to say out their ideas out loud, that is difficult.
Maybe before we move to another topic, and building upon what you both said, with which I fully agree, there is one word that has been around the discussion so far, which is the one about trust. And Martin, you before you even used the concept of the big brother, right? So there is definitely a tension between analyzing data, generating insights, monetizing that data, and respecting citizens' privacy. One could even say respecting people's freedom, right? Because if we have this big brother observing everything, then our movements might even be constrained. Now, you said that, Martin, you said the answer, the solution might not only be technology. However, there's one very important topic that we should all probably take into account, which is the one of privacy-preserving technologies. Where I know that you in Estonia with X-Road and company are experts, right? So the very basic notion of privacy-preserving technologies are technologies that allow you to generate some insights out of data, some knowledge that is valuable for those data scientists that Katrin was mentioning, that is valuable for those regulators, institutions, companies that have to create the value, that are the ones that are actually innovating, but that at the same time respects the privacy of the citizens. So it's somehow through technological advantage, through innovation, and the ranking we're discussing today is a lot about innovation, we can have the cake and eat it too. And I think that this is an important thought to throw into the discussion, put into the table.
Specifically, let me go into into some of the comments in the chat. There is an ongoing debate on the chat regarding GDPR. Arshad now says that in India, there are no regulations around privacy, and this explains why in India there is a boom for fintech and digital innovations. Alexandra says that actually companies do care about the GDPR. And I think there is a question that I find interesting for all of us from Patrick, who says, do you guys think that European GDPR is a constraint?
If I may throw just some simple lines as an answer, because we've studied this in one research paper very, very closely. There's one observation, one fact, which is that right after the introduction of the GDPR in Europe, European countries we observe a massive decrease in the analysis of third-party cookies, the famous or infamous cookies of the internet. So suddenly GDPR enters into force, and we observe cookies consumption in Europe dropping massively. Now, if data is a factor of production, and suddenly in Europe, boom, the use of this factor of production decreases, then we should observe some kind of harm. On the contrary, on the other side is what we observe afterwards is that the consumption of these cookies starts increasing again in European countries. So firms innovate in order to be able to analyze data while still respecting regulation. So when new regulation enters the room, then firms adapt, respect regulation, and try to innovate and produce more. So if firms wouldn't innovate, GDPR could eventually be harmful for economic production. But because firms innovate and implement things like privacy-preserving technologies, we observe that they don't. And on top of that, we respect citizens' privacy, which is fundamental for economies to thrive. I have observed.
Exactly, and would like to comment also on that, which is basically, again, you said like India doesn't have the privacy laws and things like that. I think still short-term gains should not be mixed up with fundamental values. So GDPR is hindering nothing, as Jose said, because this is our way of life. If we want to preserve free will as such, we need to do this. So it is not a question of whether I get 10 fintech companies speculating and robbing money from the stupid and the poor. It's about the fundamental values, and so it's not a question about that.
Mm-hmm. Catherine, there's a question that I want you to address that was earlier from Alessandro regarding data. Alessandro says that at some point there must be different hierarchies in data to create profitable business models, and he asks whether I think that companies need to meet a certain degree of maturity in order to benefit from data. And I think it's a very important question about business models, which type of maturity do companies need to achieve to monetize the data that they use?
Yeah, and IMD has some fantastic digital transformation classes and courses that you should look into, by the way, which is all that's the topic basically for these open programs. I think this is a very pertinent question, and the answer, of course, is it depends. I think it depends largely on the industry. It depends also on the overall level of competitors, basically. So healthcare, again, coming back to a healthcare industry, the overall level, I think, especially a few years back, of data use was, I think, relatively modest. There were a lot of the systems and technologies and digital processes that were not at all integrated, that were only using local data, etc. And I think we see that it depends on the maturity of the company, on the strategic maturity. So it has digital transformation in this case, for example, from going from a not so mature stage to a more mature stage requires really impetus from attention from the top. This isn't usually not a bottom-up process so easily, but it also depends on your level, your business, right? What are you selling? So in healthcare, again, there's now digital apps and digital therapeutics, which by definition live off the data, and then there's, let's say, dumb implants in the other extreme that really have no way of even be connected. They're just opening arteries or accessing, parts in the body. And it just really depends to have a clear opinion about what's the strategic objective that I have from the data, and what's the value I generate to my customers, to my stakeholders, etc. And then what's the format that I need to provide the services and the products in. And I think that's the maturity. But frankly, to be honest, for me, that's a maturity that is in general on strategy, independent if it's data or products or services. That is the job of a company, and the companies that are going to be successful are really good at understanding the jobs that their customers need to be done and how they can therefore help them to get that job done. Nowadays, more and more, this all involves data, because I'm not okay with faxing, my prescriptions to somebody. I want to send it in a digital format. I want it to be collected in a digital format, accessible in digital format. I want the data to be able to predict stuff on my behavior so that it's easier for me. I want Google to make suggestions of what I'm looking for. But again, for me, that's the value that the data provides. It's not per se the value of the, of data. It's the value of the services that the companies make from the data.
Yeah, so we need overall maturity. Martin, there is a comment that you made that still resonates in my mind, that you said that digital competitiveness is not so much about the technology, but about the mindset. So there is a question that I think is relevant from Pradeep, who says, how does one encourage to imbibe a positive change in mindset or culture of people about data? So what have you done in Estonia, or where the culture is actually extremely open to data and technologies? I ask you this question because one of the main problems that we see in certain countries, including Switzerland, when it comes to digital technologies, is individual attitudes towards technology and data. So despite the countries having the right infrastructure and the right technologies, then you still see that they don't use the technology as much. So how do you change mindsets?
So a lesson learned from Estonia, but not only Estonia, but I've been talking to many of the digital nations. Basically, that's an organization, so one of the most advanced digital countries in the world. And they all more or less say the same. People by design are reluctant to change. That's normal. But the way you get things moving is to get people and societies on this positive feedback loop. And what I mean is, another metaphor would be a drug dealer policy. Basically, that if you get them hooked on something and give them a kick every once in a while, which in a governmental state would be like, let's say, one hit per half a year, maybe a year, which gives the society a positive feedback, meaning that, this thing actually helped my life. I don't have to stand in the line. And for Katrin mentioned the fax machine. I've never seen a fax machine in my life. So basically, the key is to get the society on this positive feedback loop, constantly, every once in a while, doing something that actually helps people. And by that, you build the society's trust and openness gradually. And this is a long, long process. Estonia has been on this journey for 25 years, and there's a long road ahead of us. But it's important, again, for everybody to understand how this actually can work. You're on mute, Arturo.
Mute.
Yeah. Sorry. So I before I give the voice to any of you on that, there is a comment in the chat about China, and I think your answer actually applies to China a little bit, in that what we see happening in China in the last year is that the mistrust in the use of data by the government has increased. And in fact, the fact that the government makes it even more restrictive, I think reduces the ability of the nation to monetize data, because it reduces the trust and creates the wrong mindset. Yeah, just to comment on something that is said in the chat. Anything else about this topic of mindset? No, because I have lots of questions in the chat. One that I think applies to all of us is, how do you think, this is from Sandra, how do you think that companies and governments can ensure a good use of data while at the same time ensuring individual right for privacy? So where do we find the right balance? No, honestly, very often I'm talking about COVID-19, for example. When COVID-19 started, in Switzerland, we saw that the app was not heavily used because people were concerned about their privacy. And I said to myself, I don't care if the Confederation knows where I am at any point, as long as this application is useful to prevent the pandemic. So you see, I think for me, I can go to an extreme, but for other people, protection of privacy is much more important. Where do you see that companies can find the balance? Jose?
Building upon what you just said, and just to throw another concept to the table that might be interesting, there is this notion or this idea of consumers' privacy budgets. What is this? We all have financial budgets where we consume online, right, or physical products. I want to buy a digital product, and okay, how can I pay? And I try to get the best quality for the money I have. I cannot consume above my financial budget. Well, research shows that we are developing something like privacy budgets. Like, how much privacy am I willing to give away for the use of a particular product or a particular service? And this is basically something that consumers have. So firms need to assess, okay, how much privacy are my consumers willing to give away when using my service? Because if your service or your product is just too intrusive into the privacy, then they're going to perceive it as unaffordable, not in terms of financials, but in terms of privacy, and then don't use it anymore. And what we are observing is that consumers' privacy budgets are decreasing. So society is slowly but steadily becoming more privacy aware. And we observe this in the classical example of WhatsApp. I don't know if you remember when WhatsApp updated terms and conditions in January this year, and this was perceived as being more privacy intrusive. So people thought, WhatsApp now is too expensive for me in terms of privacy. And they shifted to other messaging applications that are perceived as being less privacy expensive. And I think that this answers the question, at least partly, because how can firms address these topics? Well, thinking in terms of privacy preservation. How much are my consumers going to demand? That much. Okay, let's develop our products to be more privacy respecting. I don't know what you guys think.
And echoing your concept of privacy budgets, is still the elephant in the room is concentration of wealth and things like that. So in terms of privacy budgets and things, there is two things that need to be marked. One is that privacy and should not be only left to the rich. So that's the difficult job, meaning that so that the world would not consist of only rich people having the privacy, but it would be a utility for everyone. But also, sorry, lost my train of thought. So if anybody has anything, go ahead.
Yeah, although I think it's interesting what you just said, because that's de facto already what's happening, right? You can either use an Apple iPhone and with the updates and it's for me more marketing ploy that Apple is the privacy company. Frankly, if you really look at what they're doing, it's more, maybe more marketing than substance. But anyway, the thought counts too. And then Android, which is free to use, it's linked with Google. Google hovers up your data. I think. But it's free to use, and basically you can use it without having to pay by now $2,000 for an iPhone. So I think that's already happening, and that's also happening within companies. If you look at internet usage, if you look at and within countries, when you look at internet usage, the countries that actually should have the most to catch up are the ones that also generate the least data in the developing world, in Africa, etc. And have also owned the least production factor. So I think that discrepancy between rich nations, rich people, and not so rich nations and people, and even poor, that is one of the huge effects of digitalization, and I don't currently see a trend reversing that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Tamer is making a very useful point in the chat, that maybe we don't need digital transformation if it doesn't create quality of life and value for people. And I totally agree with that. That's our perspective. That's what we call it, digital competitiveness. Okay, the ability of
No, Arturo.
Okay.
Do you have a smartphone, Arturo, or do you have a phone?
Smartphone.
But do you call it smartphone?
No.
So my point being that digital transformation is just transformation. Mm-hmm. So it's the digital is just a tool that people use, like the analogy of a smartphone and the phone. I think everybody has phones today. They don't necessarily every day say that it's a smart thing.
True. So and I agree with that. My point is much more that the question is, why do we need digital transformation? And the idea is that, are we creating jobs, or are we actually depleting planet resources? These are the questions that I think many people ask. And I think for us, we say digital transformation does create value because it makes countries more competitive. I want to ask you a final question because we have only 3 minutes and I want a fast answer from you. We initially talked about this idea of digital inequality. We have countries that are going to benefit a lot from digital technologies, countries that will not benefit as much. What can we do to close the gap? The United Nations called for a tax on data, for example, tariff on data for data exporting countries. Do you have any suggestion? What would you suggest that we do to eliminate this digital inequality?
I don't know if it's a suggestion, but an option that exists and has existed for more than a decade is the one of data fiduciaries or data cooperatives or data unions. Even if a person, an individual, produces little data compared to others, data is easily movable and can be gathered by a group of people. So let's assume that a group of data poor people decides to join a data cooperative or a data union, I may use that word, and pool all the data together, such that they can sell the rights to access that data or to analyze part of the data, or if they're even more sophisticated, to use privacy-preserving technologies to generate insights and value from that data without violating their privacy, then they're going to be able to generate income. And the nice part about it is that, in principle, as long as I have a smartphone, or whatever we want to call it, I have a very similar access to online free services no matter where I am in the world. So the data, the byproduct of this activity, is in principle going to be similar no matter what your financial background is. So there is a way, one potential way, to close the gap by enabling the formation of data cooperatives.
Mm-hmm. And continuing on Jose's point, which I fully agree with, I think we need to start building tools for the new citizen. And the new citizen is nothing to do with age or something. It's about the acknowledgement and awareness about the use of data. This is what we have been doing in Estonia to educate our people on that. And this kind of cooperatives or data brokers idea is also existing. But this is also what we are doing, for example, with the GovStack initiative, trying to build these tools on a global level. And hopefully this can help those countries that have less of data and digital economy to actually leapfrog the fax machines and the checkbook and all of those things and immediately start working in the new economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Katrin?
And then very briefly, because I echo what was said. So I think taxing is the same as with money. It'll just go to where the taxes are lax. So I don't think a global tax or unilateral tax. So actually the data stewardship, including GDPR, etc., requires a huge amount of cooperation and collaboration between countries. Doesn't matter if my data is generated in the US and it's used in Europe or vice versa. All of that, most people don't even understand how that all works. So data flows, data isn't stored in one place. So all the methods that we have for taxing and for that are location-based don't even apply here. So I think global collaboration is the first one, and we see some of it, but I think it's really hard. And then the other one, for me, is the leapfrog idea, because it's the same as with other factors of production, right? Factories, manufacturing, etc. It's the same in a way. How do you make sure that countries that are coming from maybe a poorer background on this, that they catch up? It's the same regulations and economic development, talent development, creating universities and capabilities in the country applies to, in my opinion, digital maturity.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you very much, Jose. Thanks a lot, Martin. Thank you as well to our audience from everywhere. Jordan, Japan, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Portugal, India. Thanks a lot for your attention, and hopefully, I will see you next year for the 2022 ranking. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye bye.
Thank you. Have a nice.
Thank you, Arturo, for hosting the webinar. Bye bye.